The night was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional hum of a distant car. Officer Ethan Carter exhaled, the warmth of his breath curling in the cold air as he leaned against his squad car. Another long, uneventful shift in the city's quieter district, just the way he preferred it. Then, the radio crackled. Possible disturbance behind the old warehouse on Belmont. Suspected trespassing. Nearest unit respond. Ethan sighed and pressed the button. Copy that. Unit 412 responding. He steered his car toward Belmont Street, the tires whispering against the empty road. The warehouse was one of those abandoned husks, a skeleton of the city's industrial past. Windows shattered, walls tattooed with graffiti, no one had used it for years. At first glance, there was nothing unusual. Just rusting dumpsters, broken wooden crates, and the distant wail of a siren from another part of the city. But then he heard it. A whimper. Faint. Almost lost beneath the wind. Ethan stilled, listening. It came again, sharper this time, carrying a tremor of pain. He flicked on his flashlight, sweeping it across the alley. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the source of the sound, a large, battered German shepherd curled against the cold metal of a dumpster. For a second, Ethan just stood there. The dog was in bad shape. Its fur was matted with dirt and dried blood, ribs showing through a too thin frame. A nasty gash ran along its side, and when the light hit its face, Ethan saw a flicker of something unsettling. Not fear. Not desperation. Awareness. "Hey there, buddy," Ethan murmured, crouching down. The dog flinched but didn't move away. His training told him to call animal control and wait. That was protocol. But something about this dog, something in those eyes made hesitation curl in his chest. Ethan reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I've got an injured dog at my location. Requesting animal control." "Negative, Carter. They're tied up with a multi-case situation. Estimated ETA 3 hours. Ethan clenched his jaw. The dog wouldn't last 3 hours. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath, holstering his flashlight. Then, carefully he reached out. The dog stiffened but didn't resist as Ethan slid his arms beneath its frail body. Lifting it was easier than expected, too easy. The shepherd had lost a dangerous amount of weight. He carried it to his squad car, lowering it onto the back seat as gently as possible. The dog let out a soft, pained exhale but didn't struggle. Ethan pulled away from the warehouse, glancing in the rearview mirror. The shepherd was watching him. Not just looking. Watching. A strange feeling prickled at the back of Ethan's mind as he drove. Something about this didn't feel random. 15 minutes later, he pulled into his driveway. The porch light flickered on automatically, casting a dull glow over his small, unremarkable house. "This is temporary," he told the dog as he pushed open the door. The shepherd didn't respond, just kept those sharp eyes locked on him. Inside, Ethan grabbed an old blanket and laid it on the floor in the laundry room, the easiest place to clean up if things got messy. He set the dog down carefully, wincing at the way its breathing hitched. "Hang in there," he murmured. His gaze flickered to its collar-worn, weathered leather. No tags. But something about it. Frowning, Ethan reached out and brushed the dirt away. His breath hitched. There, almost invisible beneath the grime, were faintly embossed letters. Not a name. Not an address. A number. Ethan's pulse ticked faster. This wasn't a stray. Someone had trained this dog. Someone had cared enough to mark it. So why had it been left for dead? The shepherd let out a soft sound, almost a sigh, before its eyes slid shut. Ethan sat back on his heels, watching the rise and fall of its ragged breathing. He should take it to a vet. But the nearest emergency clinic was 2 hours away. And right now, he wasn't sure the dog would make it. So it looked like they were on their own tonight. And Ethan had a feeling deep in his gut that this was just the beginning. Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter, watching the German Shepherd as it lay curled up in the laundry room. The dog's breathing had steadied, but exhaustion still clung to its battered frame. He drummed his fingers against the countertop, his thoughts tangled. That number on the collar, it wasn't an ordinary tag. Most lost dogs had a name or an address. But this? It felt deliberate. Almost like a code. He pulled out his phone, typing the sequence into a search bar. Nothing. No hits, no records, no easy answers. Frustrated, he scrubbed a hand over his face. He had questions too many. Who had owned this dog? Why was it dumped like trash behind an abandoned warehouse? And more importantly, why did he care so much? Ethan wasn't a dog person. He never had been. Pets required attachment, responsibility. And if life had taught him anything, it was that attachment led to loss. Yet here he was, babysitting a half-dead shepherd in his home, feeling something dangerously close to concern. A soft sound broke his thoughts. Not quite a growl, not quite a whimper, just a low, deliberate noise from the dog. Ethan turned to find it staring at him, its dark eyes unwavering. "What?" he muttered, stepping closer. The shepherd lifted its head slightly, ears twitching. It was weak, but there was something measured in its movements, something that didn't belong to an ordinary street dog. Ethan crouched beside it, hesitating before reaching out. The dog didn't flinch this time. He ran his fingers gently over the worn leather collar, tracing the faded number. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe he was overthinking it. But deep in his gut, he knew better. A memory surfaced years ago, back when he was a rookie fresh out of the academy. He had trained alongside the canine unit for a few weeks, learning how they operated. Their dogs weren't just animals. They were soldiers. Conditioned, disciplined, lethal when necessary. And this dog, despite its injuries, despite its exhaustion, had that same presence. Testing a theory, Ethan took a breath and spoke, keeping his voice firm. "Stay." The reaction was immediate. The shepherd's muscles went rigid, its body locking into position despite its weakened state. It wasn't just obedience. It was training. Ethan's pulse kicked up. This dog had belonged to someone important. Someone who had spent years molding it into more than just a pet. And someone, somewhere, had let it go. Or worse, had tried to get rid of it. A sharp knock on the door shattered the moment. Ethan rose, his instincts sharpening. It was nearly midnight. No one came knocking at this hour unless they had a damn good reason. He glanced at the shepherd one last time before heading toward the front door, a sudden weight settling in his chest. Something told him this night wasn't over yet. Ethan peered through the peephole. A man stood on his porch, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Late 30s, sharp suit, clean-shaven, definitely not someone from the neighborhood. Cops learned to recognize trouble, and this guy radiated it. Ethan unlocked the door, but didn't open it fully. "Can I help you?" The man's smile was tight, forced. "Officer Carter, right?" His voice was smooth, practiced. "I was hoping to ask you a few questions." Ethan's grip tightened on the doorframe. "And you are?" The man pulled out a leather badge holder, flipping it open just long enough for Ethan to glimpse an ID. Private security. No name he recognized. Just doing some follow-ups on a missing dog. "Word is you picked one up tonight." Ethan felt his pulse thrum. The shepherd. This wasn't a coincidence. He kept his expression unreadable. Lot of strays around here. The man's smile didn't waver, but something in his posture shifted. "This one's special. Its owner is looking for it. They're willing to compensate you for the trouble." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. No questions asked. Ethan stared at the envelope, then at the man. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. This wasn't someone looking for a lost pet. This was a cleanup job. Slowly, he stepped back and crossed his arms. Funny thing, if a dog's lost, most owners post flyers. They don't send guys in $1,000 suits to buy it back. The man's smile thinned. It's not your concern, officer. Just take the offer. Ethan let the silence stretch, watching him. The shepherd had been dumped, left for dead. And now, someone wanted it back desperately enough to throw cash at him in the middle of the night. He exhaled, shifting his stance. If you're really looking for a missing dog, file a report. Go through proper channels. The man's jaw ticked. We'd rather not. Yeah, Ethan said. I figured. The man held his gaze a second longer, then slipped the envelope back into his coat. His expression smoothed out, but there was something colder beneath it now. If you change your mind, officer, let me know. But a word of advice? His voice dipped, quiet and sharp. Some things are better left alone. Ethan didn't move as the man turned and walked back to a sleek black sedan parked down the street. The engine purred to life, and the car melted into the night. Only then did Ethan shut the door, his mind racing. Who the hell had he just pissed off? Behind him, the shepherd let out a slow, deliberate huff, almost like it had been waiting for him to figure it out. Ethan ran a hand through his hair and muttered, Yeah. I know. We're in deep now. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee growing cold beside him, eyes fixed on his laptop screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. That man at his door hadn't been a simple security officer. He had come with a purpose, and Ethan knew enough about the way the world worked to recognize when someone was trying to make a problem disappear. The dog in his laundry room wasn't just any stray. Someone had thrown it away, then sent men in suits to retrieve it. Why? And more importantly, what the hell had he just stepped into? He exhaled sharply and finally started typing. First, he ran a standard search for lost or stolen police K-9 South. Nothing recent. Then, he dug deeper, scanning through old missing reports, abandoned investigations. Still nothing. His gaze flicked toward the laundry room, where the shepherd shadow, as he had started calling it in his mind, was curled up, watching him with those same sharp, knowing eyes. Frustrated, Ethan pushed away from the table and went to grab his jacket. If the system wasn't giving him answers, maybe someone else could. He clipped a leash onto Shadow's collar, not that the dog resisted, and led him outside. The crisp night air hit his face as he stepped onto the empty streets, the silence wrapping around him like a weighted blanket. There was only one person he knew had enough connections to point him in the right direction. The drive was short. 10 minutes later, he pulled into a dimly lit lot behind an old auto repair shop. The sign overhead was faded, the windows dark, but Ethan knew better. This place never really closed. He stepped out, Shadow falling into step beside him, and knocked twice on the heavy metal door. A pause. Then the sound of locks shifting before the door creaked open, revealing a man in grease-stained coveralls, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in Ethan and the dog. "Carter," the man grunted. "It's been a while." "Yeah," Ethan said. "Didn't think I'd need a favor, but here we are." The man leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "You don't usually show up in the middle of the night. What's this about?" Ethan exhaled and stepped forward, keeping his voice low. "I need a trace on a dog. Not just any dog, a K9. No name, just a serial number on the collar." That got the man's attention. He glanced down at Shadow, his expression shifting. "Where'd you find it?" "Behind a warehouse. Someone dumped him, then sent a guy in a suit to buy him back. Something's off, and I need to know why." The man studied him for a moment, then sighed and stepped aside. "Come in." Ethan didn't hesitate. He had a feeling he was about to learn something he wasn't ready for. The shop smelled of motor oil and cigarette smoke, the air thick with the scent of old rubber and metal. Ethan followed the man through the cluttered garage, past rusted toolboxes and half-assembled engines, until they reached a small office in the back. A single desk, an ancient computer, and stacks of paperwork covered in grease stains. The man Felix sat down, cracking his knuckles before pulling the keyboard closer. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Ethan unhooked Shadow's collar and placed it on the desk, tapping a finger against the faintly embossed number. Felix squinted at it, typing quickly. Ethan waited, the seconds stretching unbearably long, his pulse steady but insistent. He didn't know what he was expecting, maybe nothing, maybe too much. But when Felix suddenly stopped, his jaw tightening, Ethan knew he had found something. "What?" he asked, leaning in. Felix exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "This number? It's not just any canine tag. It's restricted." Ethan frowned. "Restricted how?" Felix hesitated, then turned the screen so Ethan could see. A government database flickered in the dim light, displaying a profile marked with multiple security warnings. "This dog," Felix said slowly, "was assigned to someone high up. Not just a cop. A federal task force. Special operations." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "Military?" "Worse," Felix muttered. "Deep undercover. These K-9 South weren't just trained for drug busts or bomb detection. They were used in classified operations. The kind that don't make it onto public records." Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. That explained the training, the unnatural discipline, the sharp intelligence in Shadow's eyes. But it didn't explain why the dog had been dumped, injured, left for dead. Who was the handler? Felix clicked through the files, scrolling past redacted information, until he landed on a name that made Ethan's blood run cold. Gabriel Rivera. His breath caught, a static hum filling his head. That name, he knew it. Not from the force. Not from the news. From somewhere deeper. A place locked away in a part of his mind he had long since abandoned. Felix noticed his reaction. "You recognize him?" Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared at the grainy black and white photo of a man in uniform, standing beside a younger, healthier version of Shadow. His brain fought against the flood of memories trying to break through, fragments of something he couldn't quite reach. He gritted his teeth. Where is he now? Felix hesitated. "Carter, he's dead. 2 years ago." Case went cold. Ethan clenched his fists, his heart pounding. Dead. 2 years. Something in his gut twisted sharply. He had spent his whole career chasing ghosts, looking for something he couldn't name. And now, standing in the middle of a dimly lit garage, with a half-broken dog at his side, he had found it. Gabriel Rivera wasn't just a name. He was part of something bigger. And somehow, Ethan was too. Ethan forced himself to breathe, his pulse hammering against his skull. Gabriel Rivera. The name rattled inside his head like an echo of something long forgotten. He reached out, fingers skimming over the screen, as if touching the name might unlock whatever memory was trying to surface. Dead for 2 years. That meant Shadow had been without a handler since then. But that didn't explain why someone had dumped the dog in an alley, or why a man in a suit had shown up at his door throwing cash around. Felix cleared his throat, watching him closely. "You good, Carter?" Ethan dragged a hand down his face, grounding himself. "Yeah. Keep going. I need to know everything." Felix hesitated for a second, then returned to the keyboard. The screen flickered, scrolling past encrypted files, half-redacted mission logs, and outdated reports. Rivera was deep into something before he died, Felix muttered. This wasn't a routine K-9 assignment. He was investigating high-level organized crime, underground networks, maybe even government corruption. Ethan's jaw tightened. And then what? He just ends up dead. Felix nodded grimly. Official report says he was shot in a botched drug raid. But get this, there was no formal investigation. No follow-up. Just a few lines in a case file, then nothing. Ethan's mind raced, pieces shifting into place too fast for him to process. Shadow had been Rivera's dog, trained for more than just basic police work. Rivera had been investigating something dangerous. And now, 2 years later, people were still trying to bury whatever he had uncovered. Ethan glanced down at Shadow, who was sitting beside him, eerily still, eyes locked onto the screen. As if he understood. As if he remembered. His breath came out slow, measured. If Rivera was killed in action, why wasn't Shadow retired properly? Why dump him like trash? Felix exhaled, shaking his head. That's the part that doesn't add up. Kate and 9 South don't just disappear off record. If the government wanted him gone, they'd have done it clean. But this was sloppy. Desperate. Ethan's grip on the desk tightened. Someone had wanted Shadow erased, but they hadn't expected the dog to survive. And now that Ethan had him, they wanted to make sure he disappeared for good. A slow, cold anger curled in his chest. He had spent his whole life walking away from things that didn't concern him, avoiding attachments, avoiding digging too deep. But this time, it was different. This time, the past had found him first. Felix leaned back, rubbing his temples. Whatever Rivera was onto, it didn't die with him. Someone out there still cares enough to cover it up. And now, Carter, they know you're involved. Ethan looked at the screen one last time, then at Shadow, then at the door. He knew what he had to do. Then I guess it's time I start digging. Ethan drove in silence, his grip firm on the steering wheel, the glow of streetlights flashing against the windshield. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his ears twitching at every sudden movement outside. The city felt different tonight. The usual hum of traffic, the distant sounds of sirens, even the flickering neon signs, all of it seemed heavier, like a storm brewing just beyond the skyline. Ethan's mind churned through everything he had just learned. Gabriel Rivera had been investigating something big. Big enough to get him killed. Shadow had been his partner, trained for something beyond standard police work. And now, 2 years later, someone was still trying to erase every trace of him. Ethan had stumbled into something he didn't fully understand yet, but one thing was clear, he wasn't walking away. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. His gut told him not to answer, but instincts made him press accept. A distorted voice filled the car. "Walk away, Officer Carter." Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened. "Who is this? You don't want to find out." Ethan forced a calm breath. "You're a little late." "I already did." A pause. Then, the voice dropped lower, colder. "Then you won't be breathing much longer." The call cut off. Static filled the car for a second before silence swallowed it whole. Ethan exhaled, locking his jaw. He wasn't easily shaken, but the weight of the threat settled deep. He wasn't just dealing with some low-level criminals. Whoever was on the other end of that call had resources, reach, and confidence that they could make him disappear. Shadow let out a low growl, as if sensing the shift in the air. Ethan glanced at him. "Yeah, buddy. I don't like it either." He turned the car onto a quieter street, avoiding main roads. If someone was watching, he wasn't going to make it easy for them. He needed time, a plan, and answers fast. First stop, Maria Rivera. If anyone had information about Gabriel's final days, it would be his widow. But as Ethan approached her house, something felt off. The street was too empty. The porch light was on, but the windows were dark. His gut twisted. He parked 2 houses down, killing the engine, and reached for his gun. Shadow's ears perked up, his body tensing beside him. Ethan moved quickly, keeping low, his boots silent against the pavement. He approached the house from the side, scanning for movement. The front door was ajar. A sinking feeling settled in his chest. He pressed against the wall, listening. Nothing. No TV, no footsteps, no soft hum of conversation. Just silence. He pushed the door open a fraction wider, gun raised. The living room was a mess, drawers pulled open, cushions slashed, picture frames shattered. Someone had been searching for something. Then, a sound. A faint, muffled noise from the back room. Ethan's pulse spiked. He moved carefully, stepping over broken glass. Shadow stayed close, his body low, his breathing steady. The door to the bedroom was slightly open, and as Ethan reached for it, his mind braced for the worst. But when he pushed it open, what he found made his blood run cold. Maria Rivera was tied to a chair, a strip of duct tape across her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. And standing beside her, gun in hand, was the same man who had knocked on Ethan's door just hours ago. The man smiled. "Took you long enough." Ethan didn't hesitate. His gun was already raised, fingers steady on the trigger, but the man didn't look nervous. If anything, he seemed amused. The pistol in his hand remained pointed at Maria's temple, his grip loose, confident. "Let her go," Ethan said, his voice calm, controlled. The man tilted his head, eyes flicking briefly to Shadow, who stood rigid beside Ethan, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. "I thought you'd be smarter than this, officer," the man mused. "You should have taken the money. Now look where we are." Ethan's mind raced, calculating every possible outcome. The distance between them, the angle of the gun, the slight tremor in Maria's breathing. He needed a distraction, an opening, something. "You went through all this trouble just to scare me off?" Ethan asked, his tone edged with mockery. "That's sloppy." The man smirked. "No, Carter. This isn't a warning. This is cleanup." Before Ethan could respond, the man moved. Fast. His gun swung toward Ethan, and instinct took over. A single shot rang out. Ethan fired, but so did the other man. Pain seared across Ethan's shoulder as he was thrown back against the doorway, his vision blurring for a split second. Shadow exploded forward with a snarl, launching at the man before he could fire again. The room erupted into chaos. Maria struggled against her bindings, muffled screams filling the air. Shadow slammed into the man, teeth flashing, jaws clamping down on his wrist. The gun clattered to the floor. Ethan fought past the pain, pushing himself upright just as the man twisted violently, managing to throw Shadow off. He reached for a knife at his belt, but Ethan was already moving. He lunged, tackling him to the ground. They hit the floor hard, the impact knocking the air from Ethan's lungs. The man fought like a trained operative, his strikes calculated, efficient. Ethan barely blocked a vicious punch before driving his elbow into the man's ribs. A pained grunt, but not enough. The man rolled, trying to regain control. Shadow recovered, launching again, jaws locking onto the man's arm, dragging him back before he could grab his fallen weapon. Ethan didn't waste the opening. He threw a punch straight into the man's jaw, then another, and another, until he stopped struggling. Heavy breaths filled the room. The fight was over. Ethan shoved off the unconscious man, pressing a hand against his bleeding shoulder. Shadow stood over their attacker, his growl fading into a steady, watchful silence. Ethan staggered to his feet and moved to Maria, ripping the duct tape from her mouth. She gasped, sucking in a shaky breath. "They were looking for something," she rasped. "Gabriel's files. His notes." Ethan's stomach clenched. Of course. Gabriel had been onto something before he died, something worth killing for. And whatever it was, someone was still desperate to find it. He turned back to the unconscious man. This wasn't just about Shadow. This was about everything Gabriel had uncovered. And now, Ethan was in the middle of it. Ethan pressed a hand against his bleeding shoulder, the pain sharp but manageable. He had worse. Right now he needed answers. He turned to Maria, her breath still unsteady, fear etched into her face. What did they want? He asked, his voice low but urgent. Maria swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she rubbed at the raw skin where the ropes had held her. Gabriel kept records. He knew he was in danger before he died, so he hid everything somewhere safe. They think I know where. Ethan's jaw tightened. That explained their ransacked house, the way they had torn through every drawer, every shelf. But Maria's fear told him one thing: they hadn't found what they were looking for. And that meant they would be back. Shadow let out a soft growl, his ears flicking toward the doorway. Ethan followed his gaze. The house was too quiet. The attack had been rushed, messy. That meant the guy they took down wasn't alone. Someone else was out there. Ethan grabbed the man's gun off the floor, then turned to Maria. We need to move. Now. She hesitated, eyes flicking to the unconscious man. What about him? Ethan glanced down. He didn't have time to call this in. Whoever sent this guy wouldn't wait around. They would have backup, and he wasn't about to be caught standing in the middle of a crime scene, unprepared. He pulled a zip tie from his belt, securing the man's wrists, then moved to the window. The street was still empty, but the unease in his gut wouldn't settle. Go out the back, he told Maria, his voice firm. Take only what you need. I'll cover you. She nodded quickly, disappearing down the hall. Ethan kept his gun raised, Shadow sticking close at his side. The dog was tense, muscles coiled, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Ethan didn't need words to know they were thinking the same thing. Someone was coming. Maria reappeared moments later, clutching a small leather satchel. I have everything, she whispered. Ethan nodded. He led her toward the back door, scanning every shadow. His mind worked through the possibilities. Gabriel's files, whatever they contained, were the key to everything. If they could find them first, maybe they had a shot at understanding why he was killed. More than that, they might have a way to end this before more bodies started piling up. As they stepped outside, the night air hit them like a shock. Cold. Still. Too still. Ethan's gut twisted. It was a trap. A single gunshot shattered the silence. Maria gasped as the bullet slammed into the wooden post beside her, splinters flying. Ethan grabbed her, pushing her down behind the cover of an old storage shed. Shadow snarled, ears flat against his skull. Another shot rang out, this one closer. The angle was bad. They were pinned. Ethan cursed under his breath, peering around the edge of the shed. A dark figure stood near the tree line, gun raised, calculating his next move. Ethan's mind worked fast. They wouldn't stop. Not now. He glanced at Shadow. You up for this, buddy? The shepherd's gaze locked onto him, understanding clear in his eyes. Ethan took a slow breath. Go. In a blur of motion, Shadow shot forward, cutting through the darkness like a phantom. The shooter hesitated, just long enough. Ethan swung out, took aim, and fired. A choked cry. The figure stumbled, his gun clattering to the ground. Silence. Ethan didn't move for a second, heart hammering, waiting. Then Shadow returned, panting but unharmed, his sharp eyes gleaming in the dark. Ethan exhaled, tension draining from his body. They had won this round. But he knew this was far from over. Ethan didn't waste time. He grabbed Maria's wrist, pulling her up from behind the shed, his gun still hot in his grip. The shooter lay motionless near the trees, but Ethan wasn't about to take chances. He kept his aim steady as he moved, Shadow stalking beside him, his body tense, ready for more. The night stretched thick around them, every rustling leaf, every distant sound making Ethan's adrenaline spike. He reached the fallen man, nudging the gun out of his reach with his boot before crouching down. The guy was still breathing barely. A clean shot to the shoulder had taken him down, but he wouldn't be unconscious for long. Ethan yanked the mask off his face, revealing a man in his late 40s, scarred and weathered, eyes flickering with pain and something else. Resignation. "You were sent to kill me," Ethan said, voice flat. The man exhaled shakily but said nothing. Ethan pressed his knee into the wound, making him groan. "Who sent you?" The man clenched his jaw, refusing to answer. Shadow let out a low growl, stepping closer, teeth flashing. Even in his weakened state, the man flinched. "You don't get it, do you?" he muttered through clenched teeth. "This doesn't end with me. You think taking me out changes anything? You're already dead, Carter. You just don't know it yet." Ethan held his gaze, reading between the lines. These weren't just hitmen. They were part of something bigger, something organized. He needed information, but he could already hear sirens in the distance. Neighbors must have called it in. He had minutes, maybe less. He pulled Maria back toward the car. "We need to move." They ran. Ethan shoved open the passenger door, Maria slipping in as Shadow leapt into the back. He barely had time to slide into the driver's seat before headlights flared in his mirrors. A second car had pulled onto the street, blocking their path. Damn it. Ethan's fingers tightened on the wheel. He had two choices: try to escape or face whatever was coming head-on. Then, the driver's door of the other car opened. A man stepped out, his silhouette sharp against the beams of the headlights. Ethan's breath hitched. He recognized that stance, that posture, the calm, methodical way the man adjusted his cuffs before stepping forward. Victor Rojas. Maria gasped beside him, whispering the name like a curse. He's supposed to be in prison. Ethan's pulse hammered. Victor Rojas had been a ghost for years, a name whispered in police circles, rumored to be the mastermind behind arms deals, human trafficking, and most notably the underground dog fighting rings that Gabriel had been investigating before his death. But every time law enforcement had gotten close, the charges had vanished. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence crumbled. Gabriel had tried to take him down once, and now he was here. Rojas stopped a few feet away, tilting his head slightly as he studied Ethan through the windshield. Then, he smiled. Slow. Knowing. Ethan's fingers curled around his gun. Whatever this was, whatever game Rojas thought he was playing, it had just turned personal. And Ethan wasn't backing down. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his heartbeat a steady thrum against his ribs. The street felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with an unspoken threat. Victor Rojas stood in the glow of his headlights, calm, composed, like he had all the time in the world. He wasn't holding a weapon, but Ethan knew better men like Rojas didn't need to show force to be dangerous. The real power was in the way he watched, like a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. Beside him, Maria was frozen, her breath shallow. "Ethan," she whispered, gripping the seatbelt strap across her chest. "We can't stay here." She was right. But running wasn't an option. Not now. Ethan pushed open the car door, stepping out slowly, keeping his gun at his side, but ready. Shadow moved with him, muscles taut, his eyes locked onto Rojas. Rojas exhaled a quiet chuckle. Brave, he mused. Or stupid. Ethan didn't blink. "You went through a lot of trouble to get my attention. So here I am." Rojas studied him for a moment, then motioned subtly with his hand. Behind him, the passenger door of his car opened, and another man stepped out tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black. Ethan recognized him immediately. The same guy who had tried to kill Maria earlier. The one Ethan had left zip-tied in her house. Son of a... Rojas followed his gaze and smirked. You really thought he was alone? That no one would come looking? Ethan's mind was already working through the angles. He could take out the guy first, quick, clean shot, but Rojas wasn't standing here unprotected. If he made a move, he had to assume there were more. You want the files, Ethan said, buying time. Gabriel's records. That's what all this is about. Rojas gave a slow nod. Smart boy. He took a step closer, tilting his head. Your old man was a pain in my ass. Always sticking his nose where it didn't belong. Thought he was untouchable. He smiled sharp as glass. He wasn't. A cold rage coiled inside Ethan's chest, but he kept his expression unreadable. You killed him. Rojas shrugged. He killed himself. He just didn't know it yet. He slipped his hands into his pockets, voice turning almost casual. See, the problem with men like him? They think the badge means something. That it makes them invincible. That the truth matters. But the truth is, power is what matters. Control. Ethan's stomach churned, but he refused to let Rojas see it. And yet, for all that power, you still don't have the files. Rojas chuckled again. Not yet. But I will. He nodded toward Maria. She knows where they are. Ethan glanced at her. She was gripping the dashboard, her knuckles white, but she didn't speak. Good. He needed her to stay quiet. Rojas sighed, rolling his shoulders. I'd rather not drag this out, Officer Carter. Hand over the files, and I'll let you walk away. No more problems. No more bodies. Ethan let the words hang in the air, pretending to consider them. Then he smiled, slow and sharp. You see, that's where we have a problem, Rojas. He lifted his gun just a fraction. I don't take orders from scumbags like you. Rojas' face darkened. Shame. He snapped his fingers. The world exploded. Gunfire erupted from the shadows, bullets tearing through the air. Ethan dove behind his car as rounds shattered the windshield, glass raining down. Shadow barked, snarling as he ducked low, eyes scanning for a target. Maria let out a sharp cry, shielding herself as metal shrieked from the impact. Ethan cursed. It was an ambush. They weren't getting out of this clean. Ethan moved on instinct. He grabbed Maria and shoved her down behind the car, shielding her as another round of bullets ripped through the air. The windshield collapsed inward, glass slicing across his arm, but he barely felt it. Shadow stayed low, muscles taut, eyes darting toward the source of the attack. Ethan chanced a glance over the hood. 3 shooters. One near the alley, another by Rojas' car, and the last moving fast along the side of the street, flanking them. They were boxed in. His mind raced. He needed to break their line, create an opening. He turned to Maria, his voice tight. When I say run, you take Shadow and get to that warehouse across the lot. Don't stop. Don't look back. Maria's eyes were wide, fear and resistance battling inside her. Ethan, go when I say. He didn't wait for an answer. He swung up, firing 2 quick shots. One bullet slammed into the closest attacker's shoulder, sending him spinning back with a grunt. The second grazed the guy in the alley, forcing him to duck. Not kills, but enough to make them hesitate. That was all he needed. Go! Maria didn't hesitate this time. She scrambled up, Shadow bounding at her side as they sprinted toward the warehouse. Ethan provided cover fire, emptying half his clip as the remaining gunmen redirected their attention. He heard a sharp bark, Shadow alerting him that Maria had made it inside. Good. Now he just had to survive long enough to follow. He ducked back, his pulse hammering. He was outmanned, outgunned, and bleeding. But he wasn't out of options. He reached into his belt, fingers closing around a small smoke grenade standard issue. a holdover from his tactical training days. He yanked the pin and tossed it over the car. A sharp hiss filled the air as thick white smoke billowed outward, swallowing the street. Shouts erupted as the gunman lost visibility. Ethan moved. He darted low along the side of the car, using the smoke as cover. His boots barely made a sound as he slipped toward the nearest shooter. The man was disoriented, gun raised but movements erratic. Ethan struck fast, grabbing the barrel and twisting hard. The shot went wide, ricocheting off concrete. He drove an elbow into the man's throat, then wrenched the gun free. One down. Two left. Through the haze, Rojas' voice cut sharp. "Find him. Now." Ethan didn't wait. He sprinted toward the warehouse, heart pounding. More shots rang out behind him, but he was already moving through the rusted doorway, slamming it shut behind him. He turned, gun raised, scanning. Maria was crouched behind an old conveyor belt, shadow at her side, ears flat. "You okay?" Ethan asked, breathing hard. Maria nodded, though she was shaking. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Ethan glanced at the door, then back at her. "No." She swallowed hard. "Then we finish this." A new determination burned in her eyes, one that Ethan hadn't seen before. He felt it too. There was no running now. No hiding. If Rojas wanted a fight, he was about to get one. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed an old metal pipe from the ground and wedged it against the door handle, buying them a few seconds. The warehouse was a relic from the city's past: rusted beams, shattered skylights, conveyor belts covered in dust. It wasn't much, but it was cover. He turned to Maria. "You know this place?" She nodded, still catching her breath. "Gabriel used it once. He told me if anything ever went wrong, I'd find answers here." Ethan's jaw tightened. So Gabriel had known this fight was coming, even back then. And now, it was up to them to finish it. A heavy thud against the door snapped him back. The pipe rattled. They were coming. Ethan scanned the room, mind racing. They had one advantage: the layout. The narrow walkways and old machinery made it hard to move fast. He turned to Maria, voice sharp. "Stay low. If you hear me yell, take shadow and run." She opened her mouth to argue, but he was already moving. The door burst open. Rojas' men poured in, guns raised, sweeping the space. The first man barely had time to react before Ethan fired, his bullet catching him in the leg. He went down with a grunt. Another gunman swung toward him, but Ethan was already diving behind a rusted metal crate as bullets sparked against steel. Shadow moved like a ghost through the shadows, silent, deadly. The second attacker didn't even see him coming before the dog lunged, teeth clamping onto his arm. A scream ripped through the air. Ethan used a distraction. He rolled out from cover, firing 2 precise shots. The man dropped. The warehouse echoed with silence, the fight shifting. Only one man left. Rojas. Ethan rose slowly, gun trained forward. Across the room, Rojas stood, his own weapon steady. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a calculation, a final play. "You think this ends here, Carter?" Rojas murmured. "You're just a cop. You can't stop what's coming." Ethan exhaled, steady. "Maybe not. But I can stop you." Rojas smiled. Then, without warning, he moved. Ethan fired, but Rojas was fast, twisting behind an old support beam. The shot hit metal, sparking on impact. A second later, Rojas fired back. Ethan barely dodged in time, the bullet grazing his ribs. He hissed in pain but kept moving. Rojas was circling, looking for an opening. Ethan couldn't give him one. Shadow growled low, muscles coiled. He was waiting, watching. Ethan understood. He would only get one shot at this. He met the dog's eyes, gave the smallest nod. Shadow lunged. Rojas turned at the last second, too late. The shepherd slammed into him, knocking him off balance. Ethan didn't waste the moment. He surged forward, grabbing Rojas by the collar and slamming him against the nearest wall. The impact sent dust cascading from the ceiling. Rojas struggled, but Ethan pressed his forearm hard against his throat, gun aimed at his temple. "For Gabriel," Ethan said quietly. Rojas' smirk faltered. Ethan struck fast. The butt of his gun crashed against Rojas' skull. The man went limp, collapsing onto the ground. Silence. Ethan stood there, breathing hard. Maria stared wide-eyed. Shadow panted beside him, blood on his muzzle, but his tail wagged once, just slightly. It was over. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. Rojas lay unconscious at his feet, blood seeping from the gash on his temple. The warehouse, once filled with chaos, now felt eerily silent. Maria took a shaky step forward, her hands trembling as she clutched the satchel Gabriel had left behind. "Is it over?" she whispered. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He crouched down, checked Rojas' pulse steady. He was alive, but that wouldn't last long if backup arrived. Ethan had no illusions about the kind of men Rojas worked with. This wasn't the end. It was just a pause. Shadow let out a quiet whine, nudging Ethan's leg. He looked down, running a hand over the dog's head. "Good work, buddy." Shadow's tail thumped once against the dusty floor, but his ears remained perked, still on high alert. Ethan turned back to Maria. "We need to move. Now." She hesitated, but one look at Rojas' motionless body told her everything she needed to know. They had maybe minutes before someone came looking. Ethan grabbed the satchel, slinging it over his shoulder, then motioned for Maria to follow. They weaved through the abandoned building, moving fast. The street outside was quiet, but Ethan didn't trust the stillness. He led Maria to his car, checking the perimeter before ushering her inside. Shadow jumped into the back, his body tense as if he knew they weren't safe yet. As Ethan pulled onto the road, his mind raced. Rojas was out of the picture for now, but the information in Gabriel's files was still dangerous. It had been worth killing for. And that meant it was worth protecting. Maria clutched her seatbelt, her knuckles white. "Where are we going?" she asked. Ethan's jaw tightened. There was only one option. Somewhere safe. And then, we bring this to someone who can finish what Gabriel started. The city lights blurred past as he drove, his grip firm on the wheel. He didn't know what came next, not exactly. But one thing was certain: he wasn't running anymore. He was going to end this. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, his mind running through every possible scenario. They weren't safe yet. Taking down Rojas was only the first step. There would be others. People with money, power, and no hesitation to erase loose ends. He needed a plan. Fast. He glanced at Maria. She was staring out the window, her face pale but determined. "Gabriel trusted you with this," he said. "Do you know what's inside?" She shook her head. "Not exactly. He just told me if anything happened to him, I had to make sure it got to the right hands." And nodded. "Then we find out." He pulled into a motel parking lot on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear cheap, anonymous. The cameras likely broken years ago. He got them a room, paying in cash, then led Maria and Shadow inside. The door locked behind them with a heavy click. Safe. For now. Ethan set the satchel on the table, unzipping it carefully. Inside were stacks of documents, old police reports, surveillance photos, and a flash drive. He sorted through them, his pulse quickening. Corrupt officials, secret bank transfers, names tied to government contracts and illegal operations. This wasn't just about dogfighting. This was bigger. Maria's breath hitched. Gabriel was right. This is why they killed him. Ethan clenched his jaw. And why they won't stop coming. He looked at her. We take this to the feds. Someone outside the system. Witness protection, full security. Maria hesitated. And you? Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I finish what Gabriel started. She reached for his hand, squeezing it. Be careful. Ethan gave a small nod. He turned to Shadow, who was watching him with those knowing eyes. Looks like we've got more work to do, buddy. The shepherd thumped his tail once. Tomorrow they would expose everything. But tonight, for the first time in years, Ethan felt something close to peace. He wasn't running anymore. He had a purpose. A fight worth finishing. And he wasn't alone.